Welcome to the Hamumu Halloween Home Horror Hoedown, the podcast where we watch scary movies so you don't have to.
From award-winning to completely unknown, we take them all way too seriously.
I'm your host, Mike Hommel.
And I'm your host, Solange Hommel.
Now, warning, we use a ghoulish number of spoilers, so watch the movies first.
Second warning, we don't know anything about anything, so don't take us seriously as we take these movies seriously.
Today's episode is all about high school, growing up, being young, all of that fun stuff.
Sure, okay.
And earlier this very same day, we found out that a new Linkin Park song had been released, which is impressive considering that the singer is not alive.
Yes.
And that led into you telling me about your relationship with Linkin Park. And I think it was very interesting, and I'd like you to share that with our listeners.
My relationship with Linkin Park. I guess what you're referring to is that I consider Linkin Park the band that reflected my emotional maturity at each time an album came out, it had a certain emotional feel to it, right? Linkin Park is definitely a band that puts their heart right out in their sleeve, their sleeve.
For sure.
Or right out on the stage. So each time a Linkin Park album came out, it would have the same kind of emotional stew that I had at that point in my life.
Yeah.
And the fun thing about that was as I matured and kind of got less angsty or shifted my angstiness, Linkin Park shifted too and became maybe more hopeful, more I can do things.
Yeah.
I can be active.
Less wallowy.
Yeah. And it's funny to me that I feel that way about Linkin Park, especially some of their later stuff. It really resonates. One More Light resonated so hard with me. And I know that a lot of Linkin Park fans didn't love their later work.
Yeah.
Or there were maybe not a lot of them, but there were definitely Linkin Park fans who then were oh, sellouts, you sold out. This isn't the right music. This isn't the music that you made anymore. No, it wasn't, because they grew up.
They evolved.
Yes, they became, they moved on to a different point in their emotional life. And the people who just wanted them to continue doing the same, angry Meteora stuff, those people were actually kind of stuck in their emotional development. When you listen to a band who has evolved and you're angry that they aren't still doing the same things they did 20 years before, I wonder how many people stop and think, what does that say about me?
Yeah, that's interesting.
And when you think about bands with longevity, right? The Beatles come to mind. When you listen to the Beatles from the beginning, when they were bubblegum pop, to the end when they, had all of that sitar and, they were a totally different animal, and there were so many different things in between. And I think they had the same thing. People still complained oh, well, it's different now.
It is different.
It is. They're different people now. It's
interesting you mentioned that for Linkin Park, because when I think of the kind of people who would say, oh, they changed, I picture Gamergator guys on Reddit,
sure,
those kind of guys who are very clearly emotionally stunted incels, that kind of people who just they want to stay as teenagers even though they're now 40.
And not just teenagers, but angry teenagers who don't know how to deal with their emotions.
They lash out at everyone.
Right, their only way of handling emotional feelings and big things internally is to scream and shout and smash things.
Oh, are you having a big feeling?
Yes, right? No, it's interesting. And it also, part of what we were talking about was that how sad I am now, knowing that I will continue my emotional development as I move through my life. But because Chester Bennington has died, Linkin Park is not going to continue evolving with me. And so I've lost a piece of my emotional expression. I don't know. I don't know. We might not have continued to evolve together, but like it was a good 20 years of me growing up alongside Linkin Park. And it kind of makes me sad to not know, like, I'm not going to have the soundtrack to my emotional development continuing through my life. And
unless you find someone else.
Yeah. I mean, and I have other things, but like Linkin Park just so clearly reflects me at each of those like different points. And it made me think about folks who really felt emotionally connected to Nirvana.
Yeah.
Who I was not. Like, I knew Nirvana. I had heard some of the songs on the radio. Like, I liked them fine, but I wasn't like bonded to them. I have a brother who was. And then when Kurt Cobain died, like, they lost that emotional soundtrack as well. And it gave me a little bit of like, I don't know, insight into that, especially since like the brother that I have who was that connected with them, it was very early. Like, he was a teenager at the time. And so like I don't know, I imagine that was very difficult.
Yeah. So are you going to tie this into the movie at all?
That's a setup, dude.
No, I'm just messing with you.
Oh my gosh. So let me tie this into the movie.
Oh, let's talk about movies then.
Yes. This week we are talking about a movie called School Spirit from 2019. And the thing that I picked up on very quickly, like it is not hidden in this movie, is that this is essentially based on the framework of the movie The Breakfast Club.
Yeah, very much.
Yeah, which also kind of, is one of those cultural, emotional touchstones in my life,
It's a Gen X thing.
Yeah. So, I don't know, that's also, not just musical connections and soundtracks, but The Breakfast Club is one of those movies that reflects who I was at certain points in time.
Yeah. Because you wore flannel in high school.
I did wear flannel in high school.
Yeah.
Yeah. Jeans, t-shirt, flannel. I mean, I might as well have been living in Seattle.
Yeah.
So School Spirit is very based on that. It's about, weekend detention. There's the eclectic group of people who are there, each one with their own hidden inner
each one of us
thing.
The preppy, the jock, the nerd.
Exactly.
Whatever.
The serial killer.
Each went on to be serial killers in our own right. No, they didn't. It wasn't one of those.
No. So I thought that was fun. I enjoyed that. How did you feel about like watching a horror version remake of The Breakfast Club?
Yeah, I think that's fun. It didn't push hard into that though. It kind of like, that's where it started, but then it was just sort of them wandering around the halls and whatnot. It could have used more of that, I think. More about what each of their issues were and how they played off of each other. I don't know if there was a lot of that.
I mean, they hinted at all the things, the stoner girl's mom was an alcoholic and
yes.
The bad boy, had parents that like he felt weren't, he called them losers.
Yeah.
And he's like, I'm not going to be like them. I'm going to make something of myself. Like, they all had their things. I think it was interesting to see the differences in what those things were for these kids who are like millennials, as opposed to when those kids were Gen Xers with boomer parents.
Yeah, the only one I remember is that the bad boy in The Breakfast Club his issue was that his dad beat him, and he was like, "You guys don't understand," when he finally broke down and revealed his emotional issue.
Yeah. And I think the overarching idea that especially when you are a teenager, it is very hard to recognize that other teenagers are having their own individual issues in their lives. That
everyone's focused on themselves.
Right. And they're, like everything internal in your own brain is so big, but then you look externally and you're just like, you just see the surface of people and you don't recognize that there is also equivalent turmoil happening internally for each of them.
Well, because they are their clique, oh, there's a nerd. I know his deal because he's a nerd.
Right. And I think that is a brain development sort of a thing. You are learning to categorize things because there's more information in the world than we can hold in our brains.
Yeah.
And we have to categorize things.
That makes sense.
But how detrimental that can be to relationships.
So can killing people be detrimental to relationships?
It did seem to have a bit of an impact.
Yeah. So in this weekend detention, we had 4 bad kids and 2 good kids, I guess. Erica Yang was like the valedictorian girl, and nobody knew why she was there, and she was like the main character of the whole thing. And then there was Brett, who was more of a mystery, just like some kid who, nobody knew, who never does anything bad.
At one point, somebody refers to him as the preppy one, and
he looked pretty preppy.
He did, but also I was surprised that none of them were like, "Who are you?" Mm-hmm. Like, where do you fit in? Because it wasn't clearly defined like the rest of them were.
Yeah, because then we had the stoner girl and the bad boy and stoner nerdy boy.
Yeah, Russ seemed to kind of ride that, like, there was the bad boy, Victor, and then there was Lizzie, who was like the bad girl / stoner girl.
Yeah.
And then there was Russ, who was kind of on the other side, where he like overlapped with the stoner piece, but he was more the nerd rather than the bad boy. It was also interesting, I guess, to see how the cliques have changed.
Yeah, a little bit.
And
it's
how
a shift.
Some of that, like, there's hybrid cliques now that would not have existed when we were in high school.
Yeah, at least not in our movies.
No, and also, like, I just think that there was more separation between the different groups. Like, you didn't get a lot of, like, stoner jocks.
Yeah, I guess.
I mean, there were some, but I don't know. I think they were so different. I don't know. Maybe I'm totally wrong about that.
I'm just realizing you mentioned jocks, and I was like, they didn't have a jock. And they didn't in detention. But Jason shows up later, and he is the jock.
Yes, he did not have detention, but he definitely was one of the more unpleasant characters.
Yeah, he wasn't great, but he got murdered.
Yeah, honestly, I wasn't that sad.
Yeah. So the gist of what's happening here is they're all in detention, and they're talking, like stories about, ooh, it's scary to be here in detention because I hear there's a school spirit. Get it? School spirit, who comes and kills bad kids. And they're like, what? No, that's silly. But wait, there is. And it took me 4 lines in my notes before I wrote down exactly who it was.
Yeah, I think it was pretty obvious. If for no other reason than we were getting backstory for everyone except the person who it was. I did have some question for a little while that maybe that was going to be misdirect and it was going to end up being the vice principal.
Yeah.
Because Vice Principal Armstrong, like there were signs that he was not entirely emotionally stable.
He was unstable.
And, I mean, it also turned out he was a raging alcoholic.
And he was depressed and obsessing over his ex-wife. And
yes. So he had his own issues, too, which I think, again, harkens back to the Breakfast Club because, there was that going on. But they did, like, at the end, they sort of were like, well, when Erica is talking about why she's in detention and how she basically tried to bribe him into changing her A- to A's so that she could have her perfect GPA. And she was like, ugh, it turns out he actually cares. Like, so they kind of rehumanized him after he had been murdered because, like, he didn't seem like a good person. And then it turns out, like, oh, he was a good vice principal, I guess. He just had his own emotional issues.
Just that he abused students physically.
Well, yeah, there is that. That moment where he was grabbing him and then, like, was talking to himself, like, nope, I shouldn't be touching you. I'm the vice principal. That was one of the things where I was like,
yeah.
Are you possessed?
Yeah, like, he seemed very like Norman Bates trying to control his urges.
Yes. So when Brett and Vice Principal Armstrong went out into the hallway, like after the vice principal realized, like, oh, Brett is not supposed to be here.
Yeah.
Something is wrong. What is the situation? And they go out in the hallway and we don't see either one of them. And clearly somebody ends up dead and we don't know who. I was waiting, like, I thought I knew what was going to happen, but I'm like, it's also possible that Brett was a red herring all along and that he is dead and now the vice principal is going after the rest of the kids.
Yeah, it's possible. They made an effort in the beginning of the movie, I noticed, like, every time, to make sure that Victor was away every time someone died so that you always had the option of Victor or Brett. And I'm like, it's not him. I don't know why you're doing this.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do a better job of convincing me.
Yeah. I don't know what they could have done differently, because that has to be so, it has to be so subtle.
Yeah. It's weird because the way the story is presented from the beginning is you expect it to be supernatural. Like there's weird sounds happening in the ceiling and this zombie, they call it a zombie. It's just like somebody wearing an admiral outfit because that's their school mascot.
Okay, I was just going to say, I don't know why they call it a zombie, but I do know why, because there's the whole story. There's the lore of the school, that there was a teacher who, they dumped a bucket of water on her and she had a heart attack and died.
Oh.
So then instead of anybody telling, like that, somehow that was done in a place where the kids who did it could just like hide her body in the basement. And
they put her in the admiral costume.
It was weird. And yeah, so theoretically, it was this teacher who had been kind of accidentally murdered and then like disrespectfully hidden away.
Yeah.
Who was coming back and haunting the bad kids.
Yeah. So, and we see things where we're like, ooh, it must be supernatural. But they didn't do a really convincing job of that. It was very quickly obvious to me that like, there's no ghost here. This is Brett.
Yes. At no point was I truly convinced that there was anything supernatural happening.
And I feel like they should have tried harder on that.
Well, I think part of it, like, I think there were things that they tried to do. Like, they tried to have the Admiral costume, like, drifting by in the background, where it was supposed to look sort of incorporeal, but it never did. Like, I always was like, oh, no, that's a thing. That's a solid thing in the real world. Then the other thing I think they tried to have us think like, ooh, the ghost is here, is there were streamers everywhere in this school.
Yeah.
And then
it was decorated.
I mean, it was, but also like it was super obvious that those streamers were there for you to see like gusts of wind and think, ooh, spooky. Ooh. But it never felt spooky. I just was always like, oh, the AC kicked on, or like someone turned a fan on in the hallway so that the streamers would move. So I would think there was maybe a ghost. Like it didn't work for me.
Yeah. I would like to say that when Jason gets killed, he gets defeated. And I wrote that in my notes.
Boo.
But that's what happened.
Boo.
How can you boo something that really happened? And that is exactly how swords work, is if you swing one, it will just zip right through bone and sever
it's like
things.
A laser.
And then the person will fall over.
Yeah.
It was a lightsaber.
Exactly. Yes. There was that one. The one that really got me, because I have been a teacher and I have always had this like innate fear of this tool that I was expected to use regularly as a teacher. Russ, the first kid to die from this group of people. Like there's a little like
the little
prologue where there's kids we don't know who go missing. But the first kid from this group who are at detention who dies is Russ, and he has his head cut off with that like big paper cutter machine that is in every single teacher's lounge. Yeah. And I literally cannot look at one of those or imagine using one of those without like having this like internal, oh, my fingers are about to get cut off feeling.
Yeah. And ironically, when the zombie paper cutted his neck, it actually took 2 or 3 cuts to do it.
3 cuts.
Which is funny because the sword through the feet, apparently no problem. But the paper cutter, the thing that definitely is heavy, it's sharp, it's going to go through things, it might actually take a person's head off. But the sword, no way.
It probably wasn't maintained as sharply as it should have been.
That was a commentary on school supplies.
Yes. And, you very quickly learn, for whichever paper cutter you are using regularly, how many sheets of paper it can actually cut through without getting hung up in the middle.
How many bones.
Yeah, exactly. And like leaving, if you have to cut 3 times like that, like that's a jagged cut. That's not a nice, neat, like cut that paper in half.
No, that's the kind of cut you're going to have to tape the guy's head back on at the end of the movie.
I know, that was so ridiculous.
Yeah. By the way, this school is called Hellbrook, which was fun.
He's a little on the nose, if you ask me.
Indeed. So, yeah, at the end of the movie, Russ's head is taped back on because the murderer, it's Brett.
What?
Has set up a classroom, or maybe it was already set up. He said he grew up. His mom kept him in there or something. I don't know. His mom, anyway, was the teacher that was accidentally killed. And he's got her body at the head of the class in this hidden classroom that's in a secret room in the school. And as students, he has the bodies of all these people he's killed. And so he had to take the head back on, obviously.
Right.
And he's got Erica tied up. And she turns the tables on him, and yay, it's a win. But what was almost a twist that was sounding interesting, and like this movie could have, if this had happened much earlier, it could have had a whole second act that went nuts, is Erica, her whole thing was that she wanted her grades changed. She bribed for grade change, and she's like, telling him how, you think my life's so easy, I'm so special. And this is the line. She says, those grades were literally life or death to me. And I'm like, what? Because she said, like, you think my parents are all supportive or whatever. Those grades were literally life and death. I'm like, wait a minute. And I wanted some flashbacks about how awful and terrifying her parents were, and that she turns out to be some raging psycho because of that and kills him and, proceeds on into this whole mess. But she doesn't. She just has her happy victory and whatever.
Well, except she doesn't. Like, she turns from being the person, like, you watch her the whole movie and you're like, oh, she's this, like, perfect angel. She messed up this one time out of desperation, whatever. Like, she's planning to go to Harvard. And toward the end, it all starts coming out where she's like, I don't care about going to Harvard. I just wanted to go somewhere. And like, that was the thing.
All of that stuff felt like it was feeding into this idea.
Yes.
But it didn't quite go there.
And also the fact that she was like, this is not the first time I cheated. I cheat all the time. Like, she's like, I'm not a good student. I just know how to make sure that I get good grades. And it totally turned who she was.
That was a good twist, even though it doesn't like change the movie. It was just an interesting character twist.
But it kind of did change the movie a little bit for me, just a little, not entirely. And I don't think as much as they wanted it to, but like, she went from being that heroine kind of character to really kind of being an anti-protagonist. Because, like, she finds herself trapped and she's like, all right, I want to do what I got to do. And she starts flirting with Brett and totally, like, feeding into his delusion so that she can get the sword and, like, get him, save herself. And the really cool part, this is the part that I thought was probably the best thing in the whole movie, was that at the end, when the fire department comes and they're like, what happened? You see her realize, this is how I get into Harvard.
Which, I mean, that is kind of what I was looking for, but I was expecting bigger. But the fact that she twisted into this is all scheming and scary, that was good.
She becomes a very different person than she has. Like, we as the audience have been just as fooled as the rest of her classmates and her teachers.
I thought that was good.
Until the end.
And that was Brett's whole thing, was that he kills the bad kids. There can't be bad kids. So he was like, oh my gosh, Erica, how could you end up in detention? It's so upsetting. And she's like, I don't know. But it turns out she was very much a bad kid all along.
Yeah. The whole Brett and his mother thing felt very forced to me.
I mean, that was crazy. Like, that's not a realistic plot line.
The point where I first was like, what? Was when they're talking about this lore that is so strong and so prevalent that everyone in the school, knows about it. Like, there is this teacher who runs around murdering bad kids.
Yeah.
And when they're telling the story, they're like, so this happened 10 years ago. And I was like, wait, what? Like, that sort of thing takes decades. Like, this is the thing where, like, 2 generations ago this happened, and now we still talk about it.
Yeah.
10 years ago. And I thought, that feels like a mistake in the writing. Like, why did they say that? Well, they had to say that because 10 years ago, 18-year-old Brett was 8 years old.
Yeah.
Being homeschooled in the basement of the school his mom taught at, that she was obsessive about.
Yeah.
The whole idea behind Brett supporting Erica was that his mother had taught him this, like, fervent loyalty to the school.
Yes.
And Erica was the way he was going to get Hellbrook on the map.
Yes, they would have their first student going to Harvard.
Every single piece of that is ridiculous.
Yeah. I mean, I think it was supposed to be, kind of, I don't know about satirical, but satirical-ish, like not a real thing, but a kind of hyped up reality.
It was
kind of
like
silly
Scooby-Doo
thing.
level nonsense.
And I think they were going for that sort of,
yeah.
but I don't know if they wanted us to laugh at it per se.
Yeah, I mean, it just felt very forced and like everything fit together too perfectly.
Yeah, which I guess,
know.
I mean, that is kind of the slasher thing. It's always like, oh, but you didn't realize that was my mom, and therefore I grew up all weird and lived in the basement and stuff.
Also, like, if this teacher was so obsessed with this school and with the concept of good kids and bad kids that she, first of all, had all that loyalty to the school, but also thought the school was so bad that she wasn't willing to put her own child in it and hid him away in the basement.
Yeah, that part's a little tricky to put together.
Like, those things don't feel like they belong in the same brain.
No, it's a little weird. I could buy more, and that is basically what they said, but I could buy more that, he was her kid, all going to school and whatever. I mean, he was 8. He wasn't going to high school.
Right.
And then when she died, like, he ran away so that he didn't have to, live with step parents or foster parents or whatever.
Sure,
and
that he put himself in the basement.
Yeah, he went and lived in the school. He took his mom's body somehow and, like, put her in the basement and was just, like, there and worshiping her, and that would be it's more believable. It's still not believable. Or
that, like, the kids who accidentally killed her put her in the basement, and he, as an 8-year-old, runs away from his, like, mean aunt and uncle who keep him in a room under the stairs.
Definitely.
Absolutely. And so he, like, runs away from them and, like, hides away in the basement and then finds his mom's body, and that, like, breaks his brain. Like, there are ways that could have worked.
Sort of.
Or just add a few more generations. Like, it's not actually his mom. It was his, like, grandma.
Yeah.
There's
he's
stuff.
He's not one of the students. He's the student counselor who's been at this for 30 years.
Sure. Yeah. Or, I don't know, the vice principal.
Yeah, I know.
It all really gives this feeling, or how I ended up feeling about this movie, was that it was an entertaining story, but not a sophisticated story.
No, it was not.
And it sort of felt like I was watching a Goosebumps story.
Yeah, this was like it's a teeny bopper story, for sure.
And it was unsophisticated enough that I could look at it and be like, this is kind of silly and funny. Like, I found it humorous almost, but where I could see that someone maybe a little bit less emotionally developed, tying it back to the beginning, or someone who can relate more closely with that idea of being a teenager and feeling out of control in your own life and all of those things, might actually feel this more intensely, especially if it's not even teenagers, but like that pre-teen, like,
yeah, they're like, ooh, those 11, teenagers are so cool. I wish I could be like them.
Right.
And
like,
murder
ooh,
people.
This is so scary. And as that, I think it's a fun story. I think it's good. I think it's well done. But as a grown-up story, it's not great.
It's for kids. That makes sense.
So I feel like I'm going to just put this one right in the middle and give it 3 wads of gum stuck to the bottom of my table. I mean, it's good for what it is. It was not my favorite movie to watch, so, my personal rating is lower, but it wasn't terrible. I didn't hate it.
Okay.
I do find that I don't have a lot to say about it, though.
Sure.
So, I don't know.
Yeah, it's not something that's going to stick with me for any length of time. And it is that light, fluffy, teeny bopper horror. It reminds me of the Fear Street movies that Netflix put out recently, which is exactly in that area. So I'm going to put my personal spin into my ratings because it's my rating and give this 2.5 wads of gum under the table out of 5 because I did enjoy it. I especially, like we talked about, really enjoyed Erica's twist at the end. Like, It doesn't change the movie really, but it changes her. That was interesting. That was legitimately an interesting twist that made me go, ooh.
Mm-hmm. And it takes what otherwise would have been a very generic, like flat cardboard character, the kind of character you see a lot in these kinds of horror movies. It turned her into a full-on character, whether you realized it through most of the movie or not.
And it took a very straightforward, typical standard ending. And, the same things happened, but they felt very different with that. So I liked that.
Do you think it's an improvement on The Breakfast Club?
No, I do not. I mean, I suspect that in 2023, The Breakfast Club is full of very problematic issues, because I know all those old movies are, all those 80s movies.
Yeah.
But still, quality, though.
Yeah. Well, and it's very different. Like, The Breakfast Club was not trying to be a horror movie.
No.
It was definitely a let's talk about our feelings kind of movie.
Unless you're a vice principal, it was horror for vice principals.
Yes, it was. As most of those movies in the 80s were.
Yeah, that's true.
The vice principal and the principal were always like the epitome of bad guy.
Yeah.
That and the rich guy who wanted to stop.
Who ties his sweater around his neck.
Yes, and whose father was interfering with the town being able to use the local ski hill,
Yeah. Boy, those were the days. That doesn't happen anymore. I mean, it still happens in real life, but it doesn't happen in movies anymore.
No, and we don't address it in that lighthearted way anymore.
No, it's just not funny.
If we talk about those kinds of things, we get a movie like The Menu, not The Breakfast Club.
The Menu was very funny, though.
Fight the horror of a world gone mad.
So because we are watching a movie about kids who are in detention and, the whole school thing, I'm going to use this week's hot political tip to talk about education funding.
We should have that.
And to remind people that when you are reaching out to your elected officials, you should definitely be talking to them about the dangers of so-called school choice, which, that's the way they want to spin it, is like, oh, everyone will get choice and can go to the best possible school, when in fact it's just another way for rich people to siphon money away from the average person and into their own pockets. And I think we all need to be reminding our elected officials, especially any local elected officials or state level officials who you might be able to communicate with, who have recently become the chair of the Public Education Committee for the state of Texas House. Just, hint,
That's
hint.
Very specific.
House District 54. This is on you guys. We need to be reminding them that when we pay taxes into public funds, we expect those public funds to be used in public schools for the general public, and not to be then handed off to private schools, which don't have to accept students that they don't want to accept, who don't have to provide special education services according to federal law, who don't have to basically teach any of the things that they don't want to teach. By using school vouchers, we are essentially taking tax money, giving it to private schools, and then saying you only have to teach the kids you want to teach, and you only have to teach them what you want to teach them. And that is handing power over to people who have proven that they cannot be trusted with that level of power.
Yeah.
So, it is a dangerous shift in curriculum and control. And when you control education, you control the future of the country. And so it is not okay for us to let a small extremist group of people control the education in Texas or in our country. So make sure you're talking to your state and federal level and local level politicians about the need for publicly funded public schools.
Yeah. I just find it so infuriating how many ways there are that rich people siphon the money from poor people. Like, they're already rich. They're rich because their daddies gave them money, and then they invested it in the stock market, which is pretend money, and they became quadrillionaires.
They already have money that could be used to send their kids to any school they want to send them to. But they're like, you know what? I don't want to have to pay for that.
No, I got to get some from the little people.
Everyone else gets to go to school for free. country, but I don't want to go to that school.
Ew. There's a zombie there that kills all the bad kids, and my kids are definitely the bad kids.
Yeah. So education funding is a super important issue, and I think a lot of people don't realize how directly it ties into the future of the country, not just the future of each child who goes through school and how, what they learn and what they're able to do with their lives, but whoever is controlling curriculum is controlling how history and today will be discussed in the future. And that is huge.
Florida libraries.
Yeah.
So, with that said, sigh.
But not sigh for us.
No.
We get to go on vacation.
We will be gone for a week, and you will miss us so much because you will not be getting a podcast next week.
Sad. But we will be back the week after that with yet another horror movie review where we talk about stuff we don't know anything about.
See you guys in 2 weeks.
Bye. Don't forget to call your elected representatives.
We're just going to scoot in.
What did I tell you about the scooching?
Please, children, scooch closer. Don't make me tell you again about the scooching. You and the red, chop chop.